You picture yourself facing a medieval knight, perhaps on a war horse, the enormous sword gleaming in the sunlight and the clank of steel plates. Maybe you've seen enough movies to think you understand what you're dealing with. The honourable warrior, bound by chivalry, fighting a fair duel. But here is the harsh reality. You would be gone in 10 seconds, because everything Hollywood taught you about knights is a lie. These weren't your favourite fantasy movie heroes. These were living weapons created by a system so brutally effective that it transformed children into killing machines. They were psychological warfare specialists who would break your spirit before they broke your bones. And everything you've ever romanticized about medieval warfare will be shattered by what I'm about to reveal. The boy is 7 years old when they take him from his family. Not kidnapped, but handed over willingly by parents who see this as their son's path to power. Welcome to medieval military conditioning, where childhood ends the moment you can hold a wooden sword. This isn't horseback summer camp. The goal of this systematic brutalization is to replace all of the basic human instinct for self-preservation with ruthless, mechanical violence. Boys were beaten daily, and not as punishment, but as training. Pain tolerance wasn't built through gradual exposure. It was driven into them through repeated, deliberate trauma. They learned to take crushing blows to the head, stomach, and limbs without crying or stopping. Sword training began with wooden weapons weighing twice what steel swords would weigh. Their tiny hands bled and cracked until they formed leather-thick calluses. Thousands of times a day, they swung these practice weapons until the motion was as natural as breathing. Horsemanship training meant being thrown from horses repeatedly until they learned to fall without injury. They learned to mount a moving horse in full armor while carrying weapons, and then they learned to fight while doing it. But here's what separates knights from every warrior culture you've romanticized. The psychological conditioning was more brutal than the physical training. They were instructed to view non-knights as essentially separate species. Peasants were resources, not people. Enemy soldiers were hurdles to be eliminated as effectively as possible, not warriors. This was their programming. Knights learned to kill without hesitation and mercy. They were conditioned to enjoy the process. And this psychological programming created something terrifying. Warriors who didn't just accept death, they craved it. But the way they achieved that mindset would make modern special forces training look like kindergarten. Forget the sword! Seriously, throw that image out of your head right now. The knight's primary weapon wasn't some elegant blade for graceful dueling. It was a 12-foot lance designed to punch through armor, horses, and human bodies with the combined force of horse, rider, and gravity. A knight in full charge generated roughly 2,500 pounds of force concentrated on a steel point smaller than your thumb. That's enough force to drive completely through a human torso and keep going. The lance wasn't meant to wound, it was meant to delete you from existence. But even if you somehow survived the initial charge, you'd face something worse. A knight who dropped his primary weapon and was now genuinely angry. The sword? Still not their go-to option. Knights preferred maces, warhammers, and morning stars. These were blunt force trauma weapons designed to cave in skulls through helmets. When they did use it, the knightly sword wasn't the kind of theatrical fencing weapon you might think of. It was a brutal, useful tool for half-swording, where the point was surgically driven through armor gaps while the blade was gripped to use the sword like a spear. Knights developed fighting techniques specifically for defeating armor. Techniques with names like the murder stroke, where you use your sword like a hammer to crush skulls, or techniques for finding the 17 specific gaps in plate armor where a knife could slide between plates and into vital organs. They practiced these techniques on pigs dressed in armor. They knew exactly how much force it took to drive a dagger up through the base of a skull because they'd done it hundreds of times. But even knowing their weapons won't prepare you for the real horror. It was their armor that made them practically invulnerable to anything you could possibly do to them. Your sword bounces off, your axe skips across the surface, your arrows shatter against steel plates. Welcome to fighting something that's essentially a human tank with a medieval engineering degree. Plate armor was more than just metal gear. Each overlapping steel plate in the carefully designed system was angled to divert blows away from the body. It took months for master armorers to design suits that distributed impact force throughout the torso. The steel was harder than anything you've ever encountered. Some plate armor was literally bulletproof. Early firearms often couldn't penetrate it. But if you think armor made them slow, you'd be wrong. A properly fitted suit of plate armor weighed about 45 to 55 pounds, which is less than a modern soldier's combat gear. Knights could run, jump, climb ladders, and mount horses unassisted while wearing it. They trained in this armor until it became a second skin. The weight distribution was so precise that wearing it actually reduced fatigue in long battles compared to lighter but poorly distributed armor. But here's the truly terrifying part. Knights used their invulnerability as a psychological weapon. They would walk slowly toward enemies, letting arrows bounce off and building fear with every step. Imagine facing something that your weapons can't hurt. Something that knows your weapons can't hurt it. The knight became a weapon thanks to the armor, which did more than just provide protection. In order to punch through chainmail, gauntlets had pointed knuckles. There were spikes on the shoulder pieces for ramming. When you were 200 pounds plus 50 pounds of steel, even falling became a weapon. But the armor was just protection for something far more dangerous. A mind that had been stripped of every human discomfort about violence. What knights learned to do to their enemies would be considered war crimes today. Knights didn't just kill people, they broke them in every way, whether that was psychologically or spiritually. Medieval warfare wasn't about clean kills or honorable combat. Knights were taught to maximize suffering, to create examples that would terrify entire populations into submission. They learned that a screaming, dying enemy was more valuable than a quick, clean kill. Captured enemies weren't held for ransom if they couldn't pay. They were mutilated and released to spread terror. Hands severed, eyes gouged out, and tongues cut out. In order to maintain tactical awareness while abandoning all human empathy, knights were trained to enter controlled berserker states. Although they referred to it as battle fury, it was actually highly developed psychological conditioning. They learned to see violence as spiritual purification. Killing became a religious act. The more brutal the method, the more righteous the warrior. Before battle, knights would display the heads of previous enemies. They'd wear trophies, fingers, ears, scalps to demonstrate their experience. They wanted you to know exactly what they'd done to others before they did it to you. The psychological impact was the point. Terror was a weapon more effective than any blade. But even all of this pales compared to what separated knights from every other warrior culture in history. Their training gave them something that would make your blood freeze when you saw it in their eyes. Look into a knight's eyes during combat, and you'd see something that would haunt your final seconds. Knights were taught to suppress their emotions when engaging in combat. Not suppress it, but completely eliminate it. They engaged in meditation practices created especially to produce emotional numbing, which is the total lack of fear, empathy, or moral awareness. This wasn't bloodthirsty rage. This was cold, mechanical precision applied to human destruction. While you'd be flooded with adrenaline, confusion, and panic, the knight would be calm and watching for the exact moment when terror paralyzed you completely. They were trained to recognize the moment when an opponent's will broke and to exploit it. They didn't see you as a person fighting for their life. They saw you as a problem requiring a specific technical solution. Your death wasn't personal, but rather professional to them. Modern special forces undergo years of training to achieve a fraction of this psychological conditioning. Knights started this process as children and maintained it for decades. They lived in a state of controlled sociopathy that would be considered severe mental illness today. So when you imagine yourself facing a knight, understand what you're really imagining. A psychologically conditioned killing machine protected by nearly impenetrable armor, wielding weapons you can't defend against, with decades of training in techniques specifically designed to break human beings. You wouldn't last seconds because seconds are longer than they'd need.